All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar in the Green Shoot series. We are very, very excited to have you all present today. Think some of you might have joined these sessions before, but for those who haven't yet, in these webinar series, we highlight the diversity of research on rewilding in general, but especially in WildE and all the young talent that we also have as part of our WildE consortium. So quickly, as a little reminder, what is WildE? Well, WildE is a project funded by the European Union that looks at rewilding as a climate smart solution to both the climate and biodiversity crisis. In this project, we look at climate smart rewilding at 8 different sites across Europe, assessing the way we do rewilding in all of these sites. And in this project, we have a really great team of researchers from all over Europe. And in this webinar series, we highlight their work, we present the diversity of the work, and we also show all the young talent that we have. So if you're interested in this series in general, please also join us for upcoming sessions. With that, I am very excited to announce the speakers for today. With us are Gabriel Miret and Tristan Bakx, who are both from CREAF in Barcelona. This is the second time we have people presenting from CREAF in Barcelona. And I think it's very excited to have this combination two-part series. And specifically, Gabriel and Tristan, they work on the impact of rewilding on biodiversity and bird communities specifically, and will present some of their work today. After the presentation, there will be plenty of time for questions, but if you have any, please put them in the chat so that we can save them and ask them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please note that this webinar is recorded and we will upload it afterwards on YouTube so you can look back at it if you missed anything along the way. To start us off today, Tristan, please, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you everybody for coming. So today I will present work on forest disturbances that I've been working on for the last year, where we looked across all of Europe what the effect has been of all sorts of forest disturbances on the trends of European birds. I have done this together with other people at CREAF and other European institutions. And this work is not only part of the WildE project, but also part of the Biodiversa Plus SPEAR project. Yes. So I will get into it. We know very well at the local scale that different forest structures and disturbance dynamics allow for different habitats for birds. So let's say we have a forest and that is inhabited by these forest birds, such as the goldcrest or the black woodpecker, and then it's disturbed by any mean, right? So it can be fire or storm or beetles or the forest is harvested and you get these open patches. Then we see that other species, open habitat species, are inhabiting these places. Then after a while, there's some regrowth of some shrubs and some trees, some small trees, and we see that species like the yellowhammer or the red-backed shrike, they inhabit these places for a while, like it's a few years after the disturbance. And then the forest regrows and it's young forest, and then in the end it turns back into mature forest, and this cycle continues. So we know at like local scale quite well that that these processes are affecting habitat suitability and that they reorganize the community of birds that you find in a landscape. What we also know is that we see more and more of these types of disturbances that result in canopy gaps, so that result in openings in the forest. So over time, we see that the area of canopy openings per year is increasing. So we have here these blue and these green bars, and this is true for both the planned, so that means the harvesting of forest, and unplanned disturbances. We have harvests and we have natural disturbances like fire or storms or beetles. We also know that the number of birds that we find in Europe is changing over time. So when we look at all common birds, then since the 1980s, all common birds have decreased somewhat, while forest birds have initially decreased and now are sort of on a trajectory of recovery. And farmland or open habitat birds have decreased a lot in Europe. So we see these like large scale patterns of forest disturbances, and we see large scale patterns of bird abundances. And what we wanted to do in this study is to combine these two things. We wanted to know whether forest disturbances that result in canopy openings have affected the abundance trends in Europe. And we specifically wanted to know if if the trends of species related to different types of vegetation, so species related to this, like to the original forest, or species related to open habitats, or species related to this intermediate phase where the forest is recovering a little bit, whether they respond differently to these canopy openings. And whether the time since the canopy opening has happened, like in this cycle that I just presented, whether that matters. So we had a lot of data on birds between the years 2000 and 2022. There were millions and millions of birds counted all across Europe on nearly 20,000 sites by a lot of volunteers. And we used all these like black dots here, all these sites where birds were counted, to relate that to forest disturbances. And we used data for 107 species of birds that we thought to be related either to forests, to intermediate structures. So here there's like some kind of like shrubs or semi-open habitat, or to completely open habitat. So with only herbaceous vegetation and no like shrubs or trees. So that we could see whether these different groups respond differently to forest disturbances. And for the forest disturbance data, we had a brand new satellite-derived data set that quantifies for every year since 1985 what the area of disturbed forest is. So we could use this to say for every point where birds were counted, how much of the area was disturbed in the years prior to that the birds were counted there. So we have here this red dot, this is a site where it is counted, and then in this pink circle, we say like which is a percentage of forest that is disturbed. So we related those things to each other and did some fancy modeling that I will not bore you with today. And then we can go directly into the results. When we look at the results, here we count the number of species that respond positively or respond negatively to the occurrence of forest disturbances. And we did this for, on the y-axis here, new forest disturbances, so less than 6 years old, sort of older forest disturbances, 6 to 11 years old, and 12 to 17-year-old forest disturbances. And we said, how does this work in landscapes with little forest, landscapes with an intermediate amount of forest, and landscapes that are almost completely covered by forest? And when you see these darker colors, that means that the results are significant. So when we look at all species, then we see that similar number of species is responding positively and negatively to forest disturbances, meaning that, well, that's what we could expect, right? Like we have all sorts of species in this in these models, and we see that that there's a variety of responses. But when we look at specifically the forest species, then we see, as expected, that a large share of the forest species that we looked at is responding negatively to forest disturbances. Also what we expected. The removal of forest is bad for forest birds. And this was the case for any type of context. So in landscapes with a low amount of forest, as well as landscapes with a high amount of forest, or in between. So we can think here of species like the middle spotted woodpecker, the greenish warbler, the nuthatch, typical European forest species that are responding negatively to this. There were some species that we classified as forest species, like the common redstart, that responded positively, but the common redstart is a species that is quite quite a generalist actually in terms of the habitat that it occupies. Then we looked at intermediate vegetation species, so these species associated with shrubland and trees, and we saw that, like as expected, a disturbance was actually quite good for these species, and especially in landscapes with a high amount of forest. So these are landscapes where initially there's very little habitat available for them, and then the removal of forest means that suddenly more habitat becomes available for them. So we're thinking about shrikes, and this is windchat or windchat, I think, that are responding positively here. While the sorrel bunting is a species that is actually quite associated to relatively dense woodlands and shrublands, that one was responding negatively. Then we see that for open habitat species, the opposite is happening as for the intermediate vegetation species. So only in landscapes with very low forest cover is the effect of forest disturbances positive for these species. And that is because they don't really occur much anyway in forested landscapes. And there's just a big benefit of removing the last little bits of forest from landscapes that are already quite open for these species. And we can think of species like the skylark or the hoopoe that are very typical of open landscapes. Now, there's a slide that has been skipped here. Well, I will just tell it without the slide. What we can see here is that for the conservation of birds, we can think about are forest disturbances a good thing or a bad thing for the conservation of birds? This is still not completely clear, and we saw in the first slide of the results that there are a similar number of species responding positively and negatively to forest disturbances. But when we looked at the specific groups, we saw that in all cases, like no matter the context, no matter how old the disturbances are, forest disturbances are bad for forest birds. We can wonder if this is offset by the benefits that might exist for other species. And we can actually see that the benefits that exist for intermediate and open vegetation species are more situational than the negative effects for forest birds. So here you have to be very careful about saying that, for example, the harvesting of forest is as good as it is bad, because what we actually see here is that it is always bad for forest birds and sometimes good for other species of birds. Now, in terms of rewilding, the dataset that we used with the satellite observations of forest disturbances is a dataset that only detects forest disturbances where almost all trees are removed. So what you can see here on the right side. The dataset is less good at detecting places like what we see on the left side, where a fire went through and there's still quite a lot of standing deadwood and standing trees remaining after the fire. So this study is including like mostly these very severe disturbances. While we know that natural disturbances are quite often more moderate than things like the harvesting of forest. So there might be, and we also know that more moderate disturbances actually can result in more habitat for species. So there might be an opportunity for rewilding to steer, in general, the harvesting of forest, for example, towards a more moderate harvesting of forest. Like instead of clear cutting large patches of forest, maybe doing selective harvesting or harvesting smaller patches of forest. As well as for natural disturbances right now, there's a lot of salvage logging going on, which is removing all these dead trees after the natural disturbance happened. But there might be, like, to reduce the intensity of the disturbance, there might be it might be a good thing to reduce that kind of activity and increase actually habitat for birds. And that way, it possibly would balance out this like negative and positive effect. That was it from my side. I would like to thank you all very much for your attention. And I would like to hand the floor to Gabriel, who will tell you more about the relationship between birds and forest structure.
Thank you very much, Tristan. Let's see if this works now. I think it. Yeah, okay. Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabriel Miret, and I'm currently pursuing a PhD in forest ecology and in CREAF and CTFC in Catalonia. My research focuses on developing a forest biodiversity indicator that will allow us to assess the current and future status of the Mediterranean forest biodiversity in relation to the structure, as Tristan already said, and consequently our capacity to influence it, obviously, through forest management. So while Tristan's research covers the whole of Europe, it's not changing. Yeah, okay. I work particularly on the Mediterranean region, which is considered to be one of the biodiversity hotspots of the world, and their forests cover 1/3 of the total forest area in Europe. So they play a key role within the European restoration policies and the goal of halting biodiversity decline. Within this vast area, though, my research focuses on Catalonia, a northern region of Spain, which can be considered a Mediterranean study case. As you will see in the next slide, the forest in Catalonia spans, it's not showing, it was a bit slow maybe. Yeah, okay. The forest spans 60% of the land of Catalonia, including shrub and woodlands. Actually, we have kind of the opposite situation than in north of Europe, where here we have the forest cover has increased in the last few decades due to abandonment of agricultural lands and other practices. However, as you can see in these graphics, mostly the forest and woods are pretty young, between 35 and 60 years. And the lack of subsequent management of these forests has resulted them in being very dense and homogeneous, and often unable to reach the old growth stage. And that brings a series of challenges, such as increasing risk forest fire, reduced woody plant diversity, and overall biodiversity decline. In this changing context, adequate management strategies such as rewilding may be the key to counteracting all these different factors, which in the end we do not know how their overall effects on current biodiversity. So one of the tools that we have are ecological indicators. For those who are not familiar with the concept, ecological indicators are tools used to simplify and quantify complex ecological phenomena. They serve as surrogates, basically, for ecosystem health by reflecting some complex patterns in a much simpler way. For example, forest connectivity or deadwood volume would be a simple way to understand the habitat quality or the forest resilience to disturbances. Then we specifically work with ecological bioindicators. These indicators are groups of species or just a single species whose characteristics and responses to specific environmental conditions are used to assess ecosystem health. So, for example, we have this group species of forests in Europe. As Tristan already said, we have the European Common Bird Indicator at the European level that tells us how it changed, how the trends of these birds change throughout the years. And for example, for the farmland indicator, it's clear that there's been a decline through general patterns across Europe, while in forests there's been a slow decline, and maybe now we have been restoring, but it's not maybe that clear. So we need to still study why. And also, Unfortunately, we would need more indicators such as this one, as these ones are quite general, quite coarse, and the way they are done, normally they are based on expert judgment or relatively coarse quantitative methods. So we need to improve them to know more information, to more detailed information, to know how to act and how to manage our forests by knowing the actual status of them. Building on this mandate, we want to develop a forest bioindicator that tells us specific information about each region. In our case, in the Catalan forests, as an example of Mediterranean forests, so that it would tell information on how the forest structurally, if it's more, if it has better quality or less. So, for example, from if the trees are bigger or taller, or the canopy cover is wider, or there are more open canopy gaps. And from these characteristics, or even the variation across the forests of these characteristics that can be shaped by past, present, and future human management. So we want to link these characteristics to bird species as proxies for forest biodiversity. Birds are used normally in this context due to their practicality. We have a lot of data and comparative data sets, and they have been recognized as potential bioindicators. So again, as Tristan, without diving into the technical details, basically we now have, thanks to LiDAR, these extensive data sets on structural forest characteristics for Catalonia, but probably we would be able also to do it for across Europe or larger scales. And on the left side, you can see all these data, these red dots or lines that are actual surveys of bird surveys. So we can link both informations and know which species are more abundant depending on such characteristics of the forest. So going directly to the results, and I'm not going very deep into them, but generally this is a biplot where you can see all the different variables that we took into account. And basically we first found that it's true that it was more composition of the forest and elevation, such as landscape composition, that played a critical role on the abundance of these species, but also some structural variables such as canopy cover, DVH mean, played a role on species abundances. Interestingly, though, we found that some species, these are the 34 species included in the European Forest Common Bird Index, right? But as we found that they may rely heavily in forests, most of them were not as heavily influenced by the structure of forests. So, for example, from the 34, we studied 26 of them, as most of the ones that are not included here were not in the Catalan region or were very scarce. And from these 26 species, only 12 species responded well enough to at least one of the variables of forest structure. Most of them are already known as being specialists, which means they could be good representative of the forest structure, but only these 12 species. It seems there's 13, but actually from 5 to 7 now I realize that there's a gap, so it's 12 species. Not only this, but few species had similar response to the different variables in the model. For example, here you have we have the two strongest structural variables: the diameter, breast height, so how big are the trees, and canopy cover. And you can see that there's a variation between the species, and they each occupy a different niche, they have different sensitivities, different appreciation for these characteristics. So, and if we add on the next slide, as the previous biplot I showed you, all the variables, we can see that they are all around scattered, and that each species need different characteristics as a forest. So there's no one size fits all strategy that should work, and that has to be taken into account in all different strategies, including rewilding actions. So that would be the results of my study right now, what we have done up until this point. That said, how do we relate that to the main topic, which is rewilding? Well, thanks to this study, now we can predict how different group of species may react, right, to apply different actions, which will change the structure of the forest. So the next step that we are working on is developing the biodiversity indicator based on this refined selection of species and specialize it across our study case. So I don't know if you all attended the first part of this webinar, but if you're not, I will just summarize it very quickly. Rodrigo Balaguer showed us how, with the use of the Medfit model for our Barcelona metropolitan region, which is within Catalonia, they simulated for this region different scenarios that change the structure of the forest and the landscapes. And they analyzed, then they applied a fire connectivity index to see how it changed across different rewilding scenarios. In our case, we want to do the same, but applying our forest biodiversity index or indicator, depending on how it comes up. And we want to see how this for each pixel or each site it changes. And in the end, we would have for different scenarios similar to what Rodrigo had with the fire connectivity index, but we would have it with the biodiversity index for different scenarios, a different map showing how the biodiversity is spread across these scenarios and across this area. This is just a schematics, though we don't have it yet. But yeah, that's what's thanks to the study that we did, we can now have that will be useful to understand better how rewilding actions may improve or not these systems, our forests, and also the farmland species, obviously. But that's everything for now. Hope that it was clear enough. And then I think we will now answer all those questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Tristan. I think before we will answer any questions, we actually would like to hear a little bit from the audience. So for that, we will be using a tool called Mentimeter, which will come up shortly. All right. So the first question, so if you go to menti.com and you log in using the code above, the first question is, how could biodiversity indicators be useful when applying rewilding biodiversity conservation strategies? Right. So we just heard Gabriel talk about these different indicators and how they're developing. We are quite interested in what you think would be useful ways we could apply this. And the first thing is the decision making to benefit a range of different species. Gabriel and Tristan, how are you working with these indicators in terms of differences between species and how to prioritize different?
I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do. Obviously, the decision making to benefit a range of species it's the first thing that comes to mind. Things that we have these different sets of indicators that tells us different things on if the forest it has a set of characteristics, then the indicator will predict more biodiversity or less. And depending on which actions we can do or which objectives also, sometimes maybe there's different objectives that have to be taken into account or different factors. But thanks to these indicators, that helps us say in a very easy way what's happening, depending on some actions or factors. We can then take more adequate decisions, I think, to try to apply those strategies or those actions, and especially in rewilding, I think, yeah.
Yes, I think indeed, like something that is very important here is actually which species do you put into an indicator.
Yeah.
You can that is something that you always have to understand about this, is that is when you see these indicators that contain multiple species, you can always like select a few species that make suddenly everything look very good, or everything look like the world is ending tomorrow. And so you could see in the Gabriel study that each species has a very unique response. You saw in my study that there are species that initially we classified as a forest species that would still respond positively to the destruction of forest. So this like decision making to benefit the range of species goes both ways, right? Like the decision of what goes into your indicator, and then afterwards the interpretation of the result of the indicator for nature conservation.
Yeah. And sometimes you have to also think about the offset within an indicator even. So for example, I think that the European indicator has a lot of generalist species. So if you take that across some regions of Europe or any country actually, maybe just because the forest has expanded, these indicators will just tell you that the forest biodiversity has increased. But as we see in Mediterranean forests, most of them are just quite dense, quite so homogeneous, and basically just the generalist species probably are increasing, are expanding, and they do have the ability to just be in a forest and whatever the quality of it. But then all other species or other more sensitive species that need more diversity, a higher diversity of habitats within the forest. And that means that they are also representing these other species from other taxa that do need this kind of habitats, are being misrepresented within the indicator. So yeah, you have to always think on what is the indicator in the end telling you, and what do you want to focus when managing the forest.
And some of the responses that we see here, they talk about providing, results and communicating these results to stakeholders. You mentioned a lot about the complexity of these indicators and what actually goes into it. Have you tried using your indicators to communicate to different stakeholders, and how do you explain this complexity and the choices you've made?
That's the idea, actually. So I haven't yet developed we are in the process right now. So, but the idea is so I have like these two different projects or articles, let's say. One would be to actually the developing of the indicator with this data with the first study. Now I do know which species are most sensitive. So now I can try to develop different sets of indicators and see how these fare out and what do they actually tell. And then in this third chapter that was at the last slides I showed, the idea is to apply these indicators and then show in a very graphic way how different actions, right, different rewilding strategies could play out, and that can be quite easily explained to other to stakeholders who actually in the end play a key role in decision making. So the idea is, yes, in the final project to really translate this to the stakeholders. So yes, actually.
Wonderful. Do we move to the next question, Megan? So the question is, which should be the priority in forest management strategies, right? We have different options here, and we would like to hear which is what you would see as the priority, and you can rank them accordingly to what you would like.
That's a hard question. Depends on the point of view also of what.
How would you rank them yourself, Gavin?
I think right now it's, from my point of view, is quite good, I guess. I would put biodiversity conservation always at the top of my list. I mean, I've been a forest ecology conservation researcher. I think that's quite obvious, but at the same time, yeah, the fire risk reduction is something that it depends on the context. I mean, obviously it's very important, but it's interesting that they put it in the 6th and the first that it's changing. Okay.
Now it's changing. Yes, I have I have a PhD degree in physical geography, and I studied the sustainability of timber production during my PhD. I would actually think that for I think that for climate sustainability, production systems are very important, and there are large parts of Europe where actually the forest system is primarily a production system, and secondarily it is it is nature. The ecologist in me thinks that is a little bit of a sad statement, but at the same time, I am thinking like, yeah, the sustainability of the timber production is a very important thing as well, and we need this as well, right? For things that we consume every day, and like the furniture that we use, buildings can be constructed from this. It's very important, of course, to use that wisely,
Yeah.
which is not always done nowadays. Then I think a lot can be gained in land sharing strategies where multiple objectives are combined. And in places where maybe the timber industry is not as strong, like places of Europe where the timber industry is not as strong, such as Catalonia, for example, it could be better to focus more on biodiversity conservation and less on whatever timber industry there might exist there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hard thing, of course. Like all these things are quite important, and we are
Yes, you have
clearly,
to take
yeah,
into account all the factors, that's for sure.
yeah. Seeing the results here, we are clearly working in a
With-
rewilding ecology project.
yeah.
But we have,
And initially, we saw cultural and local community values being high up in that list.
Yeah.
And we actually see fire risk reduction being the lowest, which might be surprising to you, Gabriel, given the Mediterranean context.
Yeah, maybe it's maybe the people. Yeah, there's not so many people in the Mediterranean region today. I don't know. For me, I feel like it's something that we have to take into account always, and it's one of the main focus of nowadays management of the forest thing between this and sustainable wood and biomass production, I guess, also. So that that seems the opposite that's happening here. But I mean, yes, because in the end we have a lot of interaction between us and the natural systems, and in an ideal world we would have, or maybe not an ideal world, but maybe for the conservationists that would just try to get everything protected, we wouldn't have any interaction with the forest biodiversity, and probably then the sustainable wood and biomass production would be at the end of the list, of course. But it's not like this, and in the Mediterranean region we have a lot of interaction, and we have a lot of even, well, yeah, the cities and the places that we live are in a pattern that forests are all around us. So the fire risk reduction, it's very important. Although it's true that now it's been changing. Like maybe fire risk reduction would be more fire risk management, I guess, because since now there's have been a lot of just reducing completely eliminating all fires that start out. But in the end, how the forest and the systems are adapted here in the Mediterranean region, it makes that they are adapted to these fire regimes. So completely eliminating them, it goes against nature actually. And now we are, since a few years ago, I think, that we are starting to create more strategies of taking into account the fire and not eliminating all fires, even creating some small fires to control these dynamics. So yeah, I think it would
Interesting
be.
to hear these changes in management. Megan, could we go towards the third question that we have? So we've talked about forest disturbance today, but what do you actually think about when you see or hear about forest disturbances, and maybe also disturbance in a more general sense? Do you think this is good or bad for biodiversity? What is your opinion or thoughts behind this? And possibly if you could indicate as well whether this has changed since today, then that would be even more interesting.
Let's see if they will listen to Tristan.
I think one thing that I can comment on already, yes, exactly, is this first thing, is this has been in the datasets that we used from the forest disturbance is called the European Forest Disturbance Atlas. But not many of my colleagues actually working on the paper are very much a fan of calling all these types of disturbances, because 80% of the data that we use, or 80% of the disturbances in this map, are harvests, are artificial. They are, yeah. So I would agree that the scientific evidence supports that that clear cutting is generally worse for biodiversity than natural forest disturbances are, which generally create a larger diversity of which creates a larger diversity of habitat for the biodiversity communities there. So yeah, that was one thing. Like in my study, of course, I take a very broad look at what is a forest disturbance, and many people will only consider natural disturbances to be that, and the other thing is just a clear cut.
Yeah, I think what's essential here would be the top right answer. I think that about the disturbance intensity, which normally human disturbances are quite higher intensity than most natural dynamics. And yeah, I mean it's more, and what it's also related to what I was saying with the fire regime dynamics and managing that. If you eliminate all fires, then you are creating a lot of fuel, and that can create very much higher intensity fires, which are not good, not for us and not for the forest and the biodiversity. But with smaller fires or with more intensity, it's been proven that forests are adapted to them. So, and that gives regeneration or reset of the cycle that Tristan also was telling us at the beginning of his presentation. So, yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
there's a lot of good comments here on the
Yeah.
importance of natural disturbances, and as of course, if anybody was at the previous webinar, there was a lot of talk there about restoring by all three speakers, by Ella, by Miriam, by Rodrigo, about restoring natural disturbance regimes, and the importance of that for not only biodiversity but also for ecosystem resilience, for us as society, probably. Like probably if there's a small fire from time to time, then there's less big fires.
Yeah, completely.
So we have a few questions also in the chat, and I think the first one relates a little bit to what we've just talked about, because it asked about, have you looked at studies that look at the need for diversity in habitat for certain species? So I think, Tristan, that might also be a bit related to your research here.
Yeah, I made this very sort of strict distinction between this species is a forest species, this species is an open habitat species, this species is a intermediate habitat species. That is, of course, for many species not completely true. Like especially birds, they are quite generalist compared to, for example, plants. They fly around. They use different components of the landscape in order to get the resources that they need. And there are definitely many species that need certain type of heterogeneity in the landscapes where they occur. Yeah.
But, That's a very current, actually, discussion nowadays in that about the classification of birds into categories and being foresty or not. And there's a gradient almost, and sometimes depending on the regions, also they can adapt to different kind of forests or kind of systems. And you can see even between north and south of Europe, for example, you can have one species acting not completely different, obviously, but different ways. So it's hard to, yeah, you have to be careful with it, with classifying one species or another into one field. But that's why it's also interesting to see these studies that try to understand better how the species, the traits of the species, and how they react to different disturbances or characteristics of the forest, for example, as we did. So yeah.
And in a lot of the rewilding research, at least that what we've also had presented during this seminar, we see a lot of new novel interactions, new novel dynamics that we didn't know because we have this open-ended process where we're allowing things to change. Is this something that you have been seeing, that there is new novel interactions in this bird community when you do rewilding, in ways that you were surprised that species might turn up in one place or a different place that you weren't seeing before?
I'm not, well, Tristan, you go ahead.
I think I can speak for both of us that the studies that we've like done so far within that project have been like looking to the past, establishing
Yeah,
relationships of species with the ecosystem, and neither of us has really
looked at rewilding.
looked at rewilding specifically as
Consequences.
a process yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, where we've looked at processes that can take a role in rewilding, but not explicitly evaluated the importance of rewilding.
We could maybe think about what the rewilding processes means for the system, and then how the birds would adapt to that. That's more or less what we are doing in this in the case study of the area of Barcelona. But yeah, it's still not. It would not be really linked completely the consequences of rewilding with the adaptations of the forest birds, of all the generally the birds. So it's hard to say that. Yeah.
There's another question here, and it's specifically for Tristan from someone. Did you also do the quantitative stats you showed up front? Is that aggregated on planned versus unplanned?
Yeah. So okay.
Rather
Yeah, I can take them one at a time. The questions
yes.
that are listed here. Yeah. So the spatial or the accuracy of the model that distinguishes planned from unplanned disturbances is less good than the accuracy of the model that predicts where disturbances in general have happened. So in agreement with the producers of the forest disturbance dataset, we decided not to separate those two things from each other at the scale or at the resolution at which I was doing my analysis. Like they were like at such a fine resolution as what I'm doing, the analysis at, you cannot trust the percentage of unplanned disturbances, for example. So that's a little bit unfortunate. And I wish that the data was better, but this is the cutting edge right now. When you compare like what is planned and unplanned, the authors are more confident in showing those statistics across larger scales. So at like a NUTS3 region or at a country level, those kind of things. Like, of course, the figure that I showed was for all of Europe. And then I said, well, 20% is unplanned, 80% is planned. And the other one is about result sensitivity, temporal and spatial scales. So the first thing there is that 17 years is quite short. That is completely true. One thing that is there is that the earlier in the satellite data you go, the larger the uncertainties become. And already like 17, 18 years before the year 2000, we're already at almost at the start of the available data. So going much further back, I think another like 5 or 6 years is possible, but you also introduce more uncertainties. While for example, for bird counts that happened in the 2020s, you could of course go back 40 years or something, or 35 years. Yeah, it could change the results. Of course, there will be like over time, you would expect less negative results for the forest birds. That like as there is more forest recovery, maybe habitat returns. But I think in many places, like real high quality forest habitat for birds is older than even 35 or 40 years. Often much older. Of course, it's still like quite juvenile forest. And then looking at a larger landscape scale where the disturbed area fits more as a larger piece of the mosaic puzzle. Yeah, so here the scale is about 700 hectares around each site. So these are like little landscapes. It's not very small. It's also not very large, but many birds in the breeding season have a much smaller home range than that. So we're already at like for a bird, we're looking at a quite large landscape. I think one thing, the last question is about the differences that these kind of shortcomings make for the bottom line assessment. An important thing to say here is that I'm only looking at forest disturbances. There are of course more dynamics in Europe when it comes to forest cover. There's, like Gabriel already said, there is the abandonment of farmland, where in many parts of Europe, a lot of forest has been added. And well, we also have to be real about things from a conservation perspective. It's maybe much more attractive to focus on open habitat species like farmland birds, because they've lost 60% of their populations, while forest birds have lost in recent decades much less of their populations. And simply from a perspective of looking at forest disturbances, I think it's important to think about forest birds, because these are places where there already has been forest for a long time. But we have to also think about, from a broader perspective, think about protecting open habitat species, definitely.
Yeah, I think also like when knowing how to like which forests are more high quality maybe, or which areas like the forests are better to be conserved, then maybe we want to take back some of these areas that used to be agricultural lands, or that used to be open land habitats, and that would maybe be better to improve the conservation and restoring of the farmland habitats. We need to know which places maybe we should just leave the forest be, right? And maybe these areas that we want to restore more open habitats. So at the time of making the decision of really taking back these more open land habitats, to know where would be better to do it, right? Maybe, or there's something is just a thought that I have, but not a truth or a fact. Well, yeah, something that I think that has to be investigated further.
Wonderful. Well, I think we are very much looking forward to your next steps in this research. You've mentioned a few times they will be upcoming, so maybe in a little bit we will see you back in this series.
Maybe.
For now, I think I will close the session for today. Note that, like we mentioned, this recording will be uploaded. So if anyone is here that would like to share it with people that weren't here today, in some time it will be available online. You can share it that way as well. Tristan, Gabri, thank you very much for your presentation today, and I hope to all see you next time during the next session.
Thank you, Tim.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity.